Casper and Dennis coming straight from Perth Arena after an exciting morning and afternoon of fights here, UFC 221 wrapping up, and a lot of stuff to talk about. And of course, we have to start with the main event. Yoel Romero, I don't know if he shocked the world, but he definitely impressed the crowd here in Australia. Initially being booed by the Perth fans as he came out, they loved him at the end when he stopped Luke Rockhold. Let's begin by talking about the performances, Casper. What did you think of the Yoel Romero that we saw in that octagon? And also, were you impressed knowing that he did have this short, I suppose, training camp going into the fight, had some issues cutting weight? We didn't really know where he was at.
Yeah, I mean, Luke Rockhold is still a very, very elite fighter, middleweight or otherwise. And for him to go through everything that he did, obviously, let's remember, Luke Rockhold has fought in Australia before. He's done the acclimation process. Yoel Romero coming here for the first time, like you mentioned, the short 4-week training camp to prepare for a 5-round fight. That's no easy task, especially when it's up against Luke Rockhold, the way he came in there. And another 3rd-round finish for Yoel Romero. I believe it was a double jab and then an overhand to just, you know, not only beat him, but brutally knock him out. I think you mentioned it before, Luke Rockhold still has the similar issues where he backs up straight away, which is why, in a lot of ways, I think this knockout looked similar to the Michael Bisping one. Not the finishing sequence, but Luke Rockhold backed up against the cage, sort of collapsed sitting against it, you know, with Yoel Romero raining down brutal punches for him. So I was thoroughly impressed with Yoel Romero, especially with all the, you know, crap that he had to go through beforehand, which in a lot of ways was his own fault.
It definitely, Luke Rockhold looked in there like he didn't quite know what was going on when Romero was just standing in front of him. Just standing right in front of him, Luke threw some good kicks, he threw some good shots, but you could see he was a little bit taken back by the fact that Romero was just standing right in front of him, not knowing when Romero was going to strike. Romero, very difficult guy to fight. You know, you never know exactly what he's thinking. You never know what he's going for. I was trying to analyze cage side, what kind of shots he was going for when he pretended to go for the takedown, whether he was setting up the knee. It was a very, very interesting matchup. But in the end, Luke Rockhold, like we mentioned, same problems. I mean, backing up, going backwards, not circling out. And also, you could see there's still a little bit of lack, I suppose, of belief in himself after he's been knocked out a couple of times. I don't know if it's mental. Definitely, you know, we know the chin isn't quite as good as it once was. But what kind of takeaways did you have from Luke's performance? Where do you think Luke is right now compared to his prime, compared to when he was champion?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it comes down to confidence. Like you mentioned, I think some fighters, they really do feed off momentum. And I think even though Luke Rockhold, a lot of people say that, you know, he's an arrogant guy and people say that he's unlikable. I will say this, he's a very nice, personable guy in real life. But I think despite what he says in interviews about completely destroying and, you know, planning to outclass fighters, I think that, you know, the real battle is in here. It's the one that we never see, the one that we never hear about. And I think maybe since that Michael Bisping fight, he's just not 100% himself, and I think he's still trying to find himself. And tonight was another example of him, you know, not being able to do that.
Interesting. Interim title being made up, and then no one gets it. Where does it go? Is there an interim title room, a secret room in the house somewhere where Dave Shaw puts away these titles that never get used? Who knows?
I imagine this is a very bittersweet moment for Romero because, you know, like with Robert Whittaker, he won, I don't want to say the big one. He won the interim belt last July, UFC 213, and it was a huge moment, a huge celebration. We were speaking to him afterwards, and, you know, what does it feel like to be the first Australian UFC champion? Romero could have potentially had that, you know, interviews of, you know, the Cuban equivalents of ourselves, talking to him about what it's like to be the first Cuban UFC
submission radio. Could you imagine?
Cuban UFC champion. And on one hand, he beats a very elite guy in Luke Rockhold, and on the other hand, he gets absolutely no belt to show for it. So it's you know, very bittersweet for him.
Of course, the other big takeaway from this fight is the leg injury that Yoel suffered in this fight. We're not quite sure. It looks like a suspected break in his leg.
Broken leg. Which makes it even more impressive that he's able to do that.
Very, very impressive. And, of course, this has a big impact on what happens next in the division. We know that Robert Whittaker is recovering from 1,000 different injuries and 1,000 different diseases, a little bit like Mr. Burns when he goes to the hospital and he's got 100 different diseases. And they're all stopping him. Invincible. So we don't know what's happening there, but it does look like Robert Whittaker would be fit to compete sometime soon. It doesn't look like he's going to be away for a prolonged time. We know he's back to training now.
June, July.
Yeah, he's back to training now. He says that he's weak. We've got Chris Weidman in the country as well. He just retweeted that he's the only guy in the top 5 that hasn't lost to Whittaker, that hasn't been caught for cheating with drugs or anything like that. And he seems keen to potentially take this matchup. What do you think happens with Yoel here? If this leg is as bad as it seems and he is out for the number of months that he's out, does this mean that Weidman gets this next shot in your mind?
Depends on a lot of things. It depends on how long the actual leg takes to heal, and not only that, how long is the rehab? How severe is the break? Is it a crack? Is it a fracture, or is it a break where certain muscles were damaged? What's the rehab process, and how quickly can he get back into training? We're in what are we? What month is it? February. I forget sometimes. We're in February at the moment, so it's quite a while away. If the UFC wanted to book it and say in July, I don't know. That's sometime. Is that enough? Maybe. Whittaker seems like he'll be ready. I think that because there's no interim belt, there's nothing really holding Yoel Romero to sort of claim that next title shot. If the UFC, say, wanted to do Chris Weidman, it wouldn't be some kind of huge egregious thing. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think they're going to wait, and they're going to do Romero Whittaker too. I think that if anything, Weidman's probably going to face Jacare, and I think Luke Rockhold's in this position where he's basically a step below Weidman and Jacare. They've come back, they've rebounded, they're on wins, and I think Rockhold, if anything, is probably going to fight Derek Brunson if he even stays at middleweight, because he's talking about how the weight cuts are tougher and they get harder every time. He might go and move up to light heavyweight.
The weight cut, of course, an issue for Yoel Romero. Luke Rockhold kind of getting the rough end of the stick here. We know that he got the bigger percentage of the purse for Yoel. We know this fight only got really made cemented official around 2 a.m. in the morning. There were some sticking points that the UFC and the fighters wouldn't really let us know about. So I'm wondering what that was.
And just to add to that, because we did say, surely that wasn't Luke Rockhold staying up till 2 a.m., negotiating, and what we were told is basically, no, it is, of course, the managers and the people behind the scenes. Luke Rockhold would have said, here's what I want, here's my stipulations, take care of it.
Like a game of battleship between two MMA camps. We don't know what happened behind closed doors, but it would have been interesting to be the fly on the wall there. Regardless, in my opinion, if Yoel is healthy, he does fight Robert Whittaker next if Weidman is available as well, because it's still fresh in our minds, especially in my mind, that big win that Yoel had over Chris Weidman over there in New York, that flying knee. It's hard to take out of your mind. If Robert Whittaker is still injured, maybe that rematch between Romero and Weidman would be a good one. I could see that being an interesting one. Maybe Weidman trying to get that win back. And, of course, if Yoel is injured, Chris Weidman in there against Robert Whittaker, possibly in June, July. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
These are all fun fights. And I will say it is a funny situation because this interim belt, it was really thrown in there very last second. I mean, it wasn't really necessary.
It's potentially the least meaningful interim fight that we've ever seen in UFC history. Not only to the fact that there wasn't an interim champion for a short amount of time. Let's think back to the time that Carlos Condit, for example, or a bunch of other guys had that interim belt. The belt was never even put around the waist of the fighter. Yeah. It was never cemented. It just got created and thrown away. So this has to set some kind of record.
It disappeared as quickly as it came. And we're not saying it wasn't worthy of an interim title fight because of the lack of caliber of Rockhold or Romero. It just... Whittaker's the champion. Didn't have any place.
Didn't happen. Now let's talk about the co-main event because the Aussie fans a little bit disappointed. Mark Hunt came out, almost finished Curtis Blades, and then of course Curtis Blades snuck in, took him down, and was able to dominate for the rest of the fight using his wrestling. Curtis Blades looked great today here in Perth. He looked like he was in amazing shape. Physically, he even looked a little bit sharp, a little bit more in shape than ever.
Leaner?
A bit leaner. His wrestling looked really, really good. He looked like a cat burglar on the prowl when he was taking Mark Hunt down. And Mark Hunt, we didn't get a chance to speak to him, but we noticed a little bit of a limp over the last couple of days as he was walking around. He didn't attend the post-fight press conference, but possibly an injury, possibly an issue with training. We know that sometimes Mark Hunt has issues with training, has issues with cardio. What did you make of the performance? What do you think this means for Mark Hunt ultimately?
I really wanted to ask Mark Hunt if he'll still continue to fight, because obviously he was in very high spirits leading into this fight, and he said that he's happy, he's healthy, and he can fight. But one of the things is he wants to be the champion, and he says that he believes he can do it in 3 fights. He's coming off that win over Derek Lewis. And if he was to, say, string together another 2 wins in the heavyweight division, being as shallow and thin as it is, that could earn you a title shot. This loss and the Alistair Overeem loss not too long ago, that's a huge setback. And so I wonder if he's going to keep fighting. And if he is, what is he going to keep fighting for? Because I believe he's got 2 more fights left. What is the plan there? It's very unlikely that he's going to win 1 more and then be competing for a title. So I'm curious about that.
From what I understand, Mark Hunt really wants to get into boxing. Now, before he can get into boxing, he has to finish out this UFC contract. I'm not sure if he's been looking at the Ali laws around it, or maybe looking at Conor McGregor. Apparently, there's some hurdles there that stop him from having these big boxing matches here in Australia and New Zealand. I think his big aim, no matter whether he wins or loses, is just riding that contract out and getting those big fights. So Will we see Mark Hunt again? I think we will. Also, he's really needed down here for these fight night cards. I mean, if they come back in November, maybe Ty, maybe Jake Matthews, but let's be honest, as big as those guys are getting, or as much as Jake Matthews has been in the UFC, Mark Hunt is really kind of the biggest draw still at the moment. You know, Robert Whittaker's a big one as well, but Mark Hunt is still right up there. People want to see those knockouts, so I suspect we might see him in November. But opponent-wise, I almost feel like the UFC had a bit of a win today. I mean, look, here's a guy that's not too happy with the UFC. A guy beat him, a young up-and-comer who they can really use in the future. A great fight for him to have in his highlight reel. And Mark Hunt, I suppose they could keep putting him up against these guys in the lower 10s, lower 15s. Just a guy that I suppose would fill the shoes in a main event here in Australia so they could sell tickets before Mark Hunt heads off into the sunset. And then when he does head off into the sunset, they can always make the point, well, hey, top 10 guys were beating Mark Hunt. If he's the Bellator champion, if he's some other champion, he's not the equivalent of the UFC champion. And I think that's important for the UFC.
And I think on the flip side, you mentioned, the UFC's win, that Curtis Blades, a really young guy, 26 years old, and you can't say it enough that it's an aging division. There's a lot of veterans, and it feels like there hasn't been much new blood for a very, very long time. Tai Tuivasa, that's another one. We'll speak about him in just a second. But Curtis Blades, a guy who's just cracked the top 5. We sort of joked about this recently on the show. I think we were speaking to Sean Sheen about how there's just a complete abyss and a lack of new contenders for the heavyweight belt, and Stipe's on his way to cleaning out the division, and we joked about, well, we might see Curtis Blades fighting for the belt. I think it was a showcase performance for him. I think it's a huge scalp beating a guy like Mark Hunt, and I think it's, in some ways, a great thing for the division, not so much at the expense of Mark Hunt, but like you mentioned, Mark Hunt will probably be gone in one way or another, whether he retires or he just leaves the UFC. And so if Curtis Blades can sort of hang on to that, I mean, we may actually see him compete for the title. And he has a huge amount of promise. Can't understate the fact that at 26, he hasn't seen his ceiling. He hasn't seen his prime. And I think if he and Ngannou had a rematch, I think that'd be a great fight, to be perfectly honest.
It's interesting that you mention that, because I feel like that is the next big match to make. Look, Ngannou, he's another guy that the UFC need. He needs a bit of a bounce back. If he wins here, the UFC win here. Curtis Blades, there's a story there. He looked great in this fight. He looked a lot better than he has in his last few fights. What would the rematch look like? Of course, you are putting up two still kind of prospects in the division, so you do lose out on one of them sort of missing out. But with everybody being booked, this could be a great fight. So very interested to see there. He needs to get into the UFC game, though. It's time for him to get in there.
Ridiculous.
After that performance, it's time.
It's the only reason I haven't bought the UFC game yet.
We're outraged. Now, let's talk about some of the other highlights of the night. I mean, you mentioned Tai Tuivasa. What did you think of his performance against Cyril Asker? I mean, Cyril being able to take some shots. This guy coming in there taking some massive, massive shots. The fight was stopped at the right time. Steve Percival doing a good job. What did you make of Tai Tuivasa and another massive performance here in the UFC?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm more impressed with, Tai Tuivasa actually getting the win or Cyril being able to absorb those. He was like he was like the Terminator, T-1000, just taking all of those. And how often do you see a fight where the finishing blow is essentially a push? I thought that was pretty crazy. Just took all those shots on the chin. I thought Tai Tuivasa, he showed a lot of experience for a guy who has been fighting, I feel like, all his life. There was a funny moment at the post-fight press conference where someone asked him if that's the most damage he's ever done to an opponent or to a person, and he said no comment. I think that says a lot. But I think he showed a lot of smart fight IQ, the way that when Cyril was shelling up and he was going to the body and he was letting those body shots fly, and he wasn't really concerned about punching himself out because he was pacing himself. So I think it's a great win, and hear me out here, but I feel like there's a lot of comparisons between Tai Tuivasa and Conor McGregor. Obviously, I'm not saying it's an apples-to-apples comparison, but I mean, let's see. They both knock people out very, very quickly, but more so their attitudes. Conor McGregor sort of has this, or at least, especially early in his career, he had this aura of just not really caring and being very, very natural, having zero fear, and never being afraid of, an open mic. And I feel like Tai Tuivasa is kind of that same guy. And Conor McGregor, now he's sort of Money Conor McGregor. Back in the day, he was, a former plumber, a guy who was, on the dole, like everybody else, who was very relatable. And I feel like Ty's kind of that same guy, just your average guy from Western Sydney, very laid back, very carefree. He has these funny quips during the press conferences. Everybody was laughing here. Everybody can't get enough of him. He's this weird enigma. I don't know what it is, but people just seem to love him, much like Conor McGregor, and yet for him it just comes off effortless. He comes off caring, but as if he doesn't give a shit at the same time. And I think there's something really captivating about that. So yeah, obviously one's heavyweight and one's a lightweight. But yeah, I see him potentially as the next big star, or at least someone that people really get around.
In the age where MMA is complicated, and I mean it is complicated, we see the training camps, we see the coaches talk about it, Tai Tuivasa makes it seem simple. You walk in there, you knock the guy out, you make some kind of amazing comment afterwards, and he's doing just that. I was thinking about some potential opponents for him. We know there's some interesting matchups happening in the heavyweight division. Maybe a Marcin Tybura, depending on what happens to him. Maybe a Steven Struve, if he loses his next fight, could be good matchups. You got Timothy Johnson out there in the wings. That could be something, a bit of a name, a bit more of a name, but definitely for me, let's not throw him to the dogs just yet. Let's not put him right up there in the division. Let's take our time here. I think this guy can build an amazing highlight reel before he makes it there. And we've got Stipe and DC fighting in the main event. We've got Curtis Blades sort of making his way up. Let's take our time here. Let's not get rid of all the prospects in one go. What do you think?
I agree. I think if there's one thing that the UFC could do, it's let their prospects build a little bit. I think somewhere between, what Bellator do, where they sort of take someone and they just feed them constant opponents that seemingly are suited for them in a stylistic matchup, somewhere between that and between what they've been doing recently, which is throwing their prospects to the wolves. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head who Tai should face next, probably because they probably be somewhat low ranked. I think that if anything, give Tai another showcase fight, and I think he'll get one sort of a lot higher on the card, because he's a guy that is really attracting a lot of attention.
Quick mention for the Jake Matthews-Li Jingliang fight. An interesting controversy happening. Matthews having Lee in a guillotine, and then Lee clawing his eyes. I haven't seen a claw that bad. He used both hands there, and some terrible refereeing by Simpson there, where he kind of lightly tapped him on the arm, like, hey, buddy.
Excuse me, do you mind not clawing his eyes out?
Can you not claw his eyes
that.
out? What amazed me about the whole situation, because I was personally outraged, and a lot of the social media community was outraged, and the referee did a terrible, terrible job in that situation. And I think somebody needs to look at that performance and really have a chat to that referee about his performance, whether or not he should still referee, because in another situation, someone could lose an eye in a situation like that. But Jake Matthews, when we spoke to him backstage afterwards, nothing but nice things to say about Lee. No hard feelings. To you, does it kind of speak to the character of Jake Matthews and who he is as a fighter?
I think some people are just a little bit more positive than others.
We're negative.
I'm negative. I'm dead inside. I'm cynical. And it was interesting because Jake Matthews was saying, look, when you're in a fight, these things happen. It's natural. I'm not going to disagree with him. He's the fighter. I'm not. I just think it's very different to what most fighters would say. And, clawing someone's eyes out, it's not something that you see often in MMA fights. It's not something that you can really compare. Like, there are fence grabs, and that it certainly seems like something that's a natural reaction. Clawing the eyes out, I don't know. I can understand it if Lee feels like he's fighting for his life in there, and not in the literal sense, but in the fight sense. Maybe that's his reaction. But yeah, I think it speaks more to Jake and who he is and what a nice guy he is, and that I guess for him it was more about celebrating the moment and feeling happy, and I guess not focusing on that. But even though it's not his responsibility to focus on that, I agree. Somebody needs to look into it. It's not Jake's issue. I think maybe Dana White should redirect some of that anger from Murray Yamasaki and,
We have a new ref now we need to focus on.
Yeah.
Let's quickly talk about some of the other standouts from tonight. Obviously, some great performances. Just quickly, Ross Pearson being able to keep his job with the UFC, winning this fight. Obviously, he was in a lot of fights back-to-back in a row. A great post-fight interview where you asked some good questions about what it felt like to actually fight in there with his wife being a ring girl, with everything on the line. So
and you could see her. You could see her when he was getting tagged.
She was very upset, and her job was to keep a happy face. It's a very weird dynamic. So check out that post-fight conference. But a couple of other standouts of the night. Obviously, Alex Vulcan was able to pick up another win, and this is a guy that's kind of flying under the radar, especially for all you guys watching from the United States or over there in Europe. This guy is an absolute killer. He mentioned he had a bad tear in his knee, 10 weeks out, MCL, 10 weeks out from the fight. Where do you see this guy now? This is obviously a guy that's had a big, successful beginning to his run in the UFC. Where would you like to see him now? Is this a guy that needs to be booked internationally ASAP? And is this a guy that needs a named opponent that people know? I know he mentioned when we spoke to him, these guys are tough. But the other fans don't know about the fact that they're tough. We know they're tough. The casual fans don't know these guys.
Yeah, look, he's undefeated in the UFC. He's won a bunch of fights now. He needs to step up in competition. He's also the kind of guy that will fight anybody, anytime, anywhere. I mean, if you threw him to the top end of the 145-pound division, he'd be more than happy to fight those guys as well. I think that he's also realized that, when we spoke to him early, he's a very nice, very friendly, very gentle, easygoing guy, and it's not in his nature to trash talk. And he's kind of got this, I don't want to say gimmick because it's who he is as a person, where he wants to fight, the bad boys, the bullies, and he's always said to us that, I'm not going to call people out and trash talk people. I want them to call me out. And I think he's kind of realized that that's it's
not really happening.
It's not really happening.
Because no one's going to be calling out a matchup with Alex Volkanovski
well,
at this
if
point.
you're Volkanovski and you want the guy who's ranked, 10, 8, 6, and he's ranked far below outside the top 15, why would those guys call you out?
Why would you do it?
I feel like he's being a little bit more assertive. You could see in his post-fight, speech in the octagon, he was really naming names. And I think people pointed this out before. He hasn't named names too many times. He said Jeremy Stevens, I think, in media. Here he's saying Jeremy Stevens. Here he's saying Andre Feely. And he's sort of mocking them a little bit, making the hand gestures, the guys that like to talk. I don't think he has anything against them, but he's trying harder to get their attention. And I think, honestly, it is about time because he put a beating on Jeremy Kennedy tonight, and I think he's definitely earned a step up in competition.
Naming names like Elaine and Seinfeld, he's not banned from any Chinese restaurants, but definitely on the radar, and I'm hoping that he gets some international exposure because this is a guy that works really, really hard and deserves a lot more attention out there in the international market. Quickly, Tyson Pedro was able to pull off an amazing Kimura. Didn't get the bonus, and Ty didn't get the bonus either. Ty not too happy in the post-fight
Nick Maynard is fleeing the country.
I saw UFC stuff fleeing out of the way as he pointed to them as he was getting off the stage. Just quickly,
he entered actually the big room. We're trying to capture it, but we couldn't. He entered the press conference room with all the media, and you just heard a big bang on the door. Everybody knew Ty was here, and he said, "Where's Mick Maynard? Where's Mick Maynard? I want to speak to him right now."
Of course, the rib injury as well to his cartilage. So a fighter, a true fighter, a warrior. Very interested to see who he gets next. But of course, the big star of the event, Casper, the man that stood out the most, the new star in the middleweight division,
Israel Adesanya. I mean, this is the guy that people have been talking about for a very long time. The UFC's been trying to get him for about 4 years. He made his debut, and I mean, sometimes you see a star is born. I'm not going to go that far. We don't know yet. He still needs to face bigger tests and bigger challenges. But as far as, a UFC debut, breaking Rob Wilkinson's nose, winning in spectacular fashion, looking very calm, very experienced. His game plan, his theory about his career was always he doesn't want to go into the UFC, with 3 fights and have a lot of hype and then get exposed. He wants to take his time and really gain the necessary experience. And he fought like a veteran. He fought like... Obviously, he was at, what was it, UFC 219. He'd made that walk before. He looked like a guy who had done it, 1,000 times. And, the crowd loved him. He put on a good promo, recycled lines, said the same thing that he said to us.
of course. Partly, we are credit for that, maybe.
I feel like we're owed royalties.
We've had about 100 pee breaks because there's free drinks here in the media room.
The dog
almost
line.
missed a couple of interviews at the end there, but we made it.
I'm glad he explained it, saying that, peeing everywhere, the dog line, it's basically like when a new dog goes in and wants to assert its dominance. And I think, again, the middleweight division is another one that's been deeply lacking in new contenders. And I think he's a little far away, but he's made a big splash, and who knows, if he keeps racking up wins, he could be a great title challenger somewhere in the future. And I got that star quality. It's one thing to be a great fighter, but he also has the gift of the gab, and he's very, very good at talking, very, very good on the mic.
He killed the hopes of all the degenerate perverts, the shower perverts, the golden shower perverts back at home, explained everything with this promo. Very excited to see what happens with him next. Before we wrap up, let's just quickly talk about the atmosphere here, because I, for one, felt really impressed with Perth Arena. This place is amazing. It's probably one of my favorite arenas that we've been in through all the events that we've covered. Obviously, we've been at the MGM, we've been at the T-Mobile. I'm not a big fan of the T-Mobile because the media area is just terrible there. MGM's obviously a classic.
It's a cupboard. We
were over in Sydney, which was a little bit disappointing a few months ago. It was a cupboard, that's right. Sometimes you feel like, am I going to wear Damon Martin now? What's going to happen next? But let's quickly talk about what your feeling of this event was. Did it feel like a pay-per-view to you?
To be honest, maybe it's just because we've done a few of these now. It felt like a fight night to me. I didn't have that pay-per-view.
We're cold inside, dead.
The air conditioning was blasting. I think it's also because a lot of the ones that the pay-per-views that we attend are in the States. They're the big marquee events, 202, 205. 193 with Ronda Rousey, that felt like a pay-per-view. I think there was too few names to really, feel like it was a pay-per-view. And I think that the people that we were expecting to come back, they're the regular, usual names on fight nights. But to be honest, the crowd was unbelievable.
Hotcakes.
Hot cakes.
Hot pies, cold drinks.
Unbelievable appreciation for the event. all week long. The weigh-ins, I remember in Sydney, it felt like there were 3 people there at the weigh-ins. I think there was a bit of exhaustion, and understandably so. It wasn't the greatest card. I feel like Sydney has sort of had enough. They'd had better cards. They kicked things off with UFC 110. How could you feel not a little bit slighted? So I understand that. But Perth was just... a lot of people at the weigh-ins, a lot of people at the open workouts. This definitely felt like a place that had their first UFC event, and the crowd was just loud and wild the entire time. One of my favorite crowds.
Yeah, Perth, you did amazing. I ran into Todd Sampson. He was a big fan of the show. I'm kidding. He didn't know who I was, but we had a good conversation.
From Body Hack. Some people
Body
don't know who Todd
Hack,
Sampson
Guru
is.
and Transfer. He's a bit of a legend here in Australia. But anyway, guys, Casper and Dennis signing out here from Perth Arena, UFC 221.
We've been here since 6:30 in the morning.
Pleasantly surprising. Very, very nice. A lot of great fans, a lot of great media here. Everybody did a great job. UFC did a great job. It's time to wrap this thing up. Got right off into the sunset. Enjoy a couple of drinks. We'll catch you guys later.